Hello, everyone.
Good evening, Dr. Siddharth.
Good evening.
I think for you it might be morning. Yeah.
Yes, it's morning.
Good morning.
Morning. Should I share my screen like I have um, in previous sessions?
Okay. You want to share it? Okay. Shivangi, just do stop sharing. Yeah.
Done, ma'am.
Over to you, Shivangi.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome again to our session. Looking forward to an amazingly insightful session on a very interesting topic. I'm sure all the delegates, along with me and Ganesh ma'am, are looking forward to it. Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you so much, Vangi. Just give me 10 seconds to get set up.
Sure.
Can you hear me, Shivangi?
Yes, sir. You're audible.
Great. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Great. Great. Should we get started?
Sure, sir.
Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. My name is Siddhant. I'm the co-founder and chief science officer at a company called Step Change. My background is primarily in developing science-based tools for environmental decision making. And so today we'll be talking more specifically about carbon accounting. The goal of today's session will be to provide an overview of how one would go about approaching the process of carbon accounting, as well as a few examples along the way of specific methodologies, etc. Please feel free to interrupt me during the presentation if you have questions, either by unmuting yourself or by raising your hand. I'm happy to pause in between and clarify any questions that you might have. Please also feel free to let me know if you want me to repeat something, or if there was something that I said that wasn't clear. Please let me know. I'm happy to repeat or clarify. With that said, I think let's get started. So this is familiar to you, but just to set some quick context on why carbon accounting is important, it's first important to quickly talk about why climate change is important. So I'm sure all of you have seen some version of this slide already, including one that was in a presentation that I gave a few weeks ago. But the high level takeaway is that because of the amount of carbon that we as a society have been putting into the atmosphere, um, climate change unfortunately does seem like it's here to stay. And so now the question is to what degree we are going to warm our climate over the next 100 years or so. And the business as usual case does not look good. So if we continue emitting greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, primarily into the atmosphere, it looks like we will achieve a high degree of warming, probably somewhere around 2.8 to 3 degrees of warming. And you can keep that number in mind, and I can explain kind of what the implications of that warming will be. But that will be roughly kind of what we can expect if we don't, change course meaningfully over the next few years. And unfortunately, because of how long the residence time is for these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we need to make some of these policy and private sector decisions quicker than maybe a lot of us are comfortable with. And so we don't have a lot of time to start thinking about, one, how much we actually put into the atmosphere, and two, how much we need to reduce over the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years. I also want to quickly talk about why it's important. So, when I say 2.8 to 3 degrees of warming, I just want to quickly talk about why that matters. And so I've put a slide here that gives you a sense of some extreme weather events and how likely they are to occur. And the warmer the climate is, so when we talk about numbers like 2 degrees, 1 degree, 3 degrees, the warmer the climate is, the more likely a lot of these extreme weather events are. Unfortunately, at this point, regardless of what we do, there's some types of chronic as well as acute events that seem to be almost certain. And when we say almost certain from a scientific perspective, these are based off of modeling projections. So things like ocean acidification, where the ocean takes up a lot of CO2 and as a result becomes more acidic, which has a lot of important implications for aquatic life. As well as heat extremes, which many of you have already experienced, just kind of experiencing an average Indian summer, and just experiencing how that same Indian summer has become a lot warmer than what you could kind of have expected on average 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so, again, the main takeaway here is that this is not just an intellectual conversation. These will have real world impacts on society. So it's something that we should care about. And again, just to kind of hit that home again, the impacts of climate will be not limited to any one particular system, but rather touch every aspect of our economy, including the private sector. And so part of the reason to throw this slide up here is that the implications of climate change are not just limited to policy, but will also very much impact how the private sector operates, including things like supply chains of companies, worker productivity, etc. So these are things that everyone in every sector of the economy needs to start thinking about. Okay, so these slides are basically just to set a tone for why we need to think about climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the two types of risks associated with climate change. And starting from now, the lens that I'm going to take is going to be one of a private sector actor, so somebody in the context of an enterprise. So there are two types of risks broadly that the private sector will be exposed to. One is called transition risk. The other one is called physical risk. So transition risk is the risk that is associated with a business that is currently quite carbon intensive, that may not sufficiently decarbonize as the economy as a whole decarbonizes. So what I mean by that is that if you are a business that emits a lot of carbon today, you may not be penalized today because the regulation of today and the market demand of today does not necessarily care as much that you are carbon intensive. But we fully expect to be in a world 10, 20 years from now where that is not the case, where both from a regulatory perspective as well as from just a market demand perspective, both your regulators and your consumers will care about your carbon intensity. And so, if you don't proactively take steps today to start accounting for your carbon and decarbonizing your business model, you might find yourself in a scenario 10, 20, 30 years from now where you're significantly more carbon intensive because of your legacy practices relative to your peers in the same sector. That type of risk is called transition risk because you are unable to then make the transition. So, that's where that term comes from. Physical risk is a completely different type of risk that is often the kind of risk we most commonly associate with climate. Physical risk means that as a business, you have an operational footprint across different geographies. You also have a supply chain footprint similarly across different geographies. Both your supply chain as well as your in-scope operations will be impacted by a changing climate. So, as we talked about, certain things being almost certain at this point, you can imagine, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, drought conditions, extreme storming, things like that, wreaking havoc on a lot of systems that we currently take for granted. And so the risks and impacts due to these chronic and acute changes in these climate patterns are deemed climate physical risk. So let me pause for a second because these are important concepts, just to see if anyone has any questions. Great. Okay. So I will continue then. One thing that I do want to highlight is that I don't want this presentation to sound doom and gloom. The risks, there are very real risks associated with climate, but these risks also come with a lot of interesting opportunities to innovate. And so you can think of, enterprises developing new technologies to tackle carbon emissions. You can develop new technologies to actually adapt to the impacts of climate change. There can be, in addition to kind of technology innovation, just business model innovation in ways that taps into different types of climate sensitive market demands. And you can also just broadly think about a whole suite of tools that needs to be that need to be developed in order, both internally and externally, in order to make informed corporate climate related decisions. So I don't want, while a lot of the emphasis today will be on, why it's important that we do this so that we prevent the risks, there are a lot of opportunities in embarking on this as well. Great. Okay. So I hope I've established why it's important that we start thinking about how much CO2 and how much greenhouse gas we're actually putting into the atmosphere. And so then the question becomes, if we agree that it's important that we understand how much we're putting into the atmosphere, where do we start? And so we start by going through what's called a carbon accounting process. Now, for enterprises, the global standard for going through this accounting process is derived from this document called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And what it does is divide your emissions into three broad scopes. So you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 emissions are emissions that are directly under your operational control that result from company facilities, company vehicles. So these are both from combustion sources, so that you can think of this as burning fuel in a diesel generator, as well as from internal combustion engine sources. So this is, using petrol in your company-owned vehicles, but also extends to fugitive emissions from other greenhouse gases, such as from sources like ACs. So the refrigerants that go into your air conditioning systems are greenhouse gases. And every year or every quarter, when you have your technician come in and fix your air conditioning systems, they'll invariably charge you for some coolant refill. Now, the amount of coolant that they are refilling is actually the amount of coolant that has escaped from your system. And as a result of escaping from your system is now in the atmosphere. Uh, this this type of emission is called a fugitive emission because it is basically a leak in your system. And it is also considered under your scope 1 emissions. So broadly, we primarily care about the greenhouse gases on top, so CO2, methane, N2O, but we also care about refrigerants like HFCs, etc. As I mentioned earlier, because they have very high global warming potentials. I'll just quickly introduce this concept of global warming potential as well. Different greenhouse gases have a different ability to warm our atmosphere, and that ability is measured on the basis of this metric called the global warming potential. So CO2, because it's normalized to CO2, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1, and then other gases have global warming potentials relative to that of CO2. So for example, N2O has a global warming potential of around 298, which means that it's around 300 times more effective at warming the Earth than CO2 is. So if you emit 1 kilogram of N2O versus 1 kilogram of CO2, the difference is a 300x multiple. So this is why we need to care a lot about the refrigerants that escape, because they can have global warming potentials in the hundreds or in the thousands. Okay, so what I've described so far are your scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that result from the purchase of energy and primarily electricity. So what that means is that if you run your operations, you are making electricity purchases every month. That electricity is being produced from some source, be it a renewable source or a non-renewable source, and as a result has some carbon footprint. So if I'm purchasing electricity that's coming from a coal power plant, the 1 kilowatt hour of that energy has an associated carbon footprint, and that carbon footprint is in my scope 2. And then scope 3 is everything else that is in your value chain. So this includes the purchased goods and services you need to run your business. It includes capital goods. It includes transportation and logistics. It includes the waste generated in your operations. It includes business travel, employee commute, the processing of your sold products, the use of your sold products, the end of life use of your sold products, etc. And as well as for banking institutions and financial institutions, the investments that you make. And so this is the general breakdown of how a company should think about its carbon emissions in these three scopes. This is also an important concept, and you'll often hear people talk about scope 1 versus scope 3. So I'm going to pause a second here again, and I'll deep dive into each of these in subsequent slides, but I'm just going to pause here for a second to see if anyone has questions. Yeah, I think we have a hand raised.
Yes. Mr. Mangesh, ask your question. Mr. Mangesh. Mr. Ramani, please ask your question.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a very interesting question. So there are certain greenhouse gases, like methane, for example, that you can actually process at point of source. So methane will actually oxidize to CO2. So even though methane has a global warming potential that is much higher than that of CO2, if you're emitting a lot of methane, what is often done, this is mostly for oil and gas companies, but they will actually flare methane, which means they will actually burn it, and the process of burning it converts it to CO2. Even if you don't do anything, it will naturally convert to CO2 in the atmosphere, but that process takes many, many years. And so while it is in its form as methane, it is a much more potent greenhouse gas. The problem with some of these other greenhouse gases, particularly the refrigerants, is that they actually have been designed to be particularly stable. So, just a quick kind of tangent. What happened actually for the refrigerants was that we used to use CFCs, as you'll likely remember, but that's gone because of the ozone implications, because they were actually not as stable as the refrigerants we use today. So in other words, what we've actually done in some ways is as an attempt to kind of solve one problem, which was the ozone problem. We've actually built these quite stable, resilient refrigerants that were actually developed specifically such that they would be stable. So the answer here is a mix of, as you're saying, there are chemical processes that one can apply at point of source in exactly the way that you're describing, to what's called scrub these greenhouse gases. And so these technologies exist. They just tend to be expensive. But the more bang for your buck approach tends to be primarily driving efficiency within your process and trying to move away from the emission of these greenhouse gases. That tends to be a little more just efficient in the long term. Does that answer? Yeah, does that answer? Sure. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. Great.
Okay.
I think we had.
Yeah, Binoy,
Yeah.
sir.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. Dant.
Good evening.
My question is with respect to the transportation, the scope 3 transportation, the upstream and downstream. Now,
Yeah.
my question is a very specific context. Now, as a non-asset based logistics service provider,
Yeah.
okay, how do I define the boundary when I compute the emissions? Now,
Yeah.
we transport our customers' goods by
Yeah.
partnering with other asset carriers.
Yeah.
But essentially, are a carrier. So, how is the boundary defined in this case?
Yeah.
Just want to know. I mean, since you are an authority on this, I'd like to understand it fundamentally. From you,
Sure.
like
Sure.
in the specific case for non-asset-based transport service provider, right?
Sure.
When we are the carbon, to be accounted on our side or on the other side.
Sure. Sure. So, great
And
question.
will there be double counting because the asset carrier would be computing that as their scope 1, maybe, right? Or scope 1 or scope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, great question. So I'll answer both of those separately. So the answer to your first question is that it is a little nuanced and it would depend a little bit on the specifics. But a good rule of thumb is to think about whether or not you have operational control over the process. Which is to say, do you have control over how much you're emitting in terms of like where people are driving and what car they're using, what logistics kind of structure exists, and are you actually in a position to make authoritative decisions in terms of saying, well, I would prefer to move from, let's say hypothetically, move from internal combustion engine operators to EV operators, like within the bounds of whatever your logistics structure is. So if you have the ability to make that decision, or if you have the ability to kind of influence that decision, then you're often deemed as having operational control over the process, at which point it does become your scope 1 emissions. If you don't have operational control, so in other words, if you are not actually determining kind of the time at which you don't actually determine kind of where the driver is driving, like what car they're driving, things like that, then it is often deemed to be scope 3. And so this is a general rule of thumb. The specifics will be a little sector specific and case specific. But general rule of thumb is that if you are controlling, let's keep it simple. Let's just imagine there's a van and there's a driver in that van. If you are controlling to some degree where that van goes and how much time it spends on the road and what the driver is doing in that van. And by controlling, I mean that driver is basically dedicating their efforts to the pursuit of your company's objectives. Then you're deemed to have operational control over that activity, and that would be classified as a scope 1 emission.
Yeah, I mean, just the context you're referring is in a domestic case. Actually, we are international, cargo logistics service provider. So whether it could be air or ocean cargo, but then we work on behalf of the customer. The customer gives some constraints there. Maybe price shouldn't be beyond this, right? So our choice of the operating carriers may reduce. Right, if we have a larger leeway, I could possibly use another carrier and offer the whole transportation service for them. So I may not have the full control, right? Maybe I can choose carrier A if the price band is more. If I'm constrained in a very low price band, I may have to depend on another carrier with which may have a higher emission intensity in the transportation. So that's where. So how do we define it? Maybe I can connect with you separately. I don't want to take more time in the session.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure,
I'll
happy
take
to chat more. Yes, happy to
yeah.
chat more, but at a high level, again, it's a little nuanced and happy to chat more on the specific use case. But at a high level, what you're describing would most likely fall under scope three,
Scope
because you
3.
don't, because you do, yeah, because you don't have operational control over. You have control over your choice of provider, but you don't have operational control over the actual process.
Yeah, but it should be counted as our scope 3, not on the asset
Your scope three.
carriers. Oh, okay.
Correct.
All
It'll
right.
be
Okay.
there. It'll be their scope one. And then to answer your second question, which is also a very relevant question about double counting. So this is a question
Yeah.
that often comes up, and the reality is that the greenhouse gas protocol was actually explicitly built to like assuming that there would be double counting. So as you very rightly said, your scope three is somebody else's scope one.
Yeah.
And as a result, if I were to add, if let's say everyone in the economy does this exercise, and I were to just add everyone's scope one, scope two, scope three, there would be a tremendous amount of double counting.
Yeah.
And so the idea here actually, ideally, is, but if I alternatively just added everyone's scope one emissions, including the scope one emissions of your electricity generator, the
Yeah.
provider, it would actually add up to the total amount. And so
True.
the idea here is that the system boundary for the greenhouse gas protocol is the entity, with the goal of saying, well, what can you control? Since you don't control kind of a systems level supply chain, you control to some degree your own value chain. You should be just thinking about your own value chain. So that's the kind of conceptual notion behind why they've kind of divided this into scope one, scope two, scope three. The
All right.
idea is definitely not to kind of for it to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. The idea instead is for you to kind of have insight into where you have decision making levers that you can pull to decarbonize
Yep.
both your individual operations but as well as your broader value chain.
All right. Okay.
Great.
I think I'll separately connect with you because I have some doubts on
Yes.
SPTI also because they haven't
Sure.
defined clearly this segment, I think. Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
Sure. Happy to.
Next, we have Mr. Pradeep.
Yes, ma'am. Hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Hi, sir. It could be silly questions, sir, but I have two questions to ask. Sir, take an
Sure.
example for the scope one. I have my technician, those who travel day in, day out, and they claim their reimbursement of the fuel. Just as a company level, we are thinking instead of that reimbursement, if we can make some amount as a fixed amount there to their CTC, does that scope one will goes out with that case? Example, instead of paying on actuals, we are just telling them we will pay 1,000 rupees whether you travel or not. It's up to you. If you maintain the site, in example, we are telecom sites. If you maintain the sites in better way, you need not have to travel. If you don't maintain them correctly, then multiple travel will happen, and that's your call. If that is the right way, wrong way, I don't know, sir. Just your thought.
So it's an interesting question. Again, it's hard to say without more details, but at a high level, if they are doing the work that is, if they're directly, driving their own transportation, but they're pursuing work that is directly for the company, then you would be deemed to have operational control over that process. So it would be your scope one emissions, regardless of whether or not you kind of ask for an itemized overview or don't. What you are describing in some ways is a internal incentive structure to reduce your scope one emissions, which is an interesting approach because you're basically saying that this is our scope one, but if you optimize your scope one, and if you optimize the process, then these individual operators also have a financial incentive to do so, which makes sense. So I would say that it would still come under your scope one, but it's an interesting approach and likely an effective approach to try and decrease your scope one via an incentive structure, but it won't actually change it in terms of the actual accounting.
But sir, actually accounting, it's because when we change this process, we don't know how much travel has been done. We don't know.
But the answer will not be to so I hear you on that, but the issue is not so much that you will be asked, like if someone were to kind of conduct an accounting exercise with you, you will, regardless of whether or not they are getting reimbursed for the amount, you will still be asked to survey how much they are traveling and what their fuel consumption is.
Okay, I have one more
So
question,
in
sir.
other
That
words,
will be the last. Thanks, sir. I got it. My next question is that I have an office where I need to pay fixed charges for electricity and for diesel also. But when the electricity goes off, then they charge for they switch on the DC, but they just simply they don't charge us extra. They monthly charge us some amount. That is my, and with the continuation of the same AC, like you had just suggested that AC coolant, whatever has been filled, that also part of annual maintenance, and I don't get any update from the building that how much they had done it. Just need your light on that one, sir.
Yeah. So again, in the same way, even though you're not getting charged for them separately, the way that an accounting exercise will probably work is by, let's say that you are, let's say you're 10 people in that building, and the building has, I don't know, 20 people total. I'm just making up these numbers. Let's say you're 10 people, the building has 20 people. That you can be deemed in some ways as, using 50% of that building's resources. The way that an accounting exercise would probably work is that you'd go to, if you cannot directly apportion what you are using, you probably go to the management and ask them, what the total electricity and fuel consumption was, including the refrigerant consumption, and 50% of that in this hypothetical example would then be apportioned to you. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, thanks, sir. Thanks. I think I got it. The clarity, what I got it understood that accounting will play a very important role in all that circumstances,
Yeah.
and in that
Yeah.
the fair input will be always helpful for the organization, right?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you.
So the answer, there's one more question that has been asked in the comments. It's
Sure.
related to financed emissions. So it says finance emissions should be limited to scope 1 emissions of the investment.
Yes. So this is broadly true. So financed emissions are largely regulated by the global standard called PCAF. And I can put that link in the chat. But the PCAF guidance, for the most part, requires that the scope 1 of your financed entity be accounted for. However, there are certain sectors, for example, energy sector, where they actually want your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And so they want a kind of more thorough accounting. Starting 2025, they will actually want scope 1 to 3 for every sector. So it is in the currently, while most sectors only require scope 1, starting in 2025, they will require every sector.
Thank you, sir.
Great. So this is so great. So I think we've kind of generally covered scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I will talk a little bit now about them in detail. And again, please stop me if you have questions. So as I was mentioning, scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are directly under your operational control. So these include, combustion sources, mobile combustion, as well as fugitive emissions, as I was mentioning. And I wanted to talk through a quick example of how you would compute scope 1 emissions. Again, this is just to be, this is, this is just conceptually how you would go about it. There are many ways in which you might actually, in practice, think about computing emissions. But in general, the idea behind, you can either directly estimate the emissions from your stack, for example. So you have like a monitor sitting on top of your pollution stack. But oftentimes that becomes very challenging and logistically very difficult to implement. And so what usually is done is using this approach, which leverages activity data. So what activity data means is basically, how much of the activity are you doing, and the units of that can be in the spend. So how many rupees are you spending on it, or it can mean quantity. So how much fuel did you use, how much distance did you travel, etc. So you take that activity data, and then you use what's called a primitive conversion factor, or what we call internally a primitive conversion factor, to convert it to a quantity. So what that means is that if I tell you that I bought 100 rupees of diesel, what is that converted into liters of diesel? So that's what that. So in this case, the primitive conversion factor is just the price of diesel. So you take that activity data, which is 100 rupees of diesel, you convert it using the price of diesel to liters of diesel, and then you use a quantity-based emission factor that basically says, for every liter of diesel that is combusted, what are the how much CO2 is emitted. So that is what the quantity-based emission factor is. Now, this quantity-based emission factor can be derived from a number of international databases, including DEFRA and the IPCC databases, which are the most commonly used ones. And so if you take these three factors, you multiply them, you can estimate your emissions for that given process. And then if you add the emissions for all such processes, you can estimate your scope 1 emissions. So this is conceptually the way in which you would calculate scope 1 emissions. I'll just pause for a second if anyone has questions about this kind of conceptual framework. Cool. Right, then continue. So the scope 2 emissions are emissions related to your purchased energy. So this is, primarily purchased electricity, but can also be purchased steam or purchased, chilled water sometimes. And so the source of these emissions can come from non-renewable sources such as coal, natural gas, etc. Renewable sources such as solar, wind, etc. And as I was mentioning earlier, oftentimes they're also in the form of the actual energy commodity, which is oftentimes, like chilled water or steam, as opposed to electricity. And similarly for scope 2, you will take your activity data. So again, this can be in terms of spend. How many rupees have I spent on my electricity? But it can also be physical data directly, in which case it's, how many kilowatt hour did I purchase? The primitive conversion factor here again is basically just the price of electricity. So what is my electricity and how much have I spent on electricity? What is my price of electricity, such that I can convert it to a kilowatt hour estimate. And then there's a quantity-based emission factor that basically says that for this, let's say for example, for the Maharashtra grid, this is the emission factor associated with 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. And so you then take that and you estimate your total emissions. I see we have a question. Yeah, 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 sure, sure. Yes, so great question. So as you mentioned, the CEA has a standard of 0.79, but it depends a little bit on how you apply that and for what purpose you're applying it. So for example, if you're using it for your BRSR reporting, it makes sense to use the CEA number, because that is what that is what most assurance providers will ask you to use. However, even in that process, as you were mentioning, if you look at other activity databases such as EcoInvent and other international databases, you will actually get grid-based factors for different parts of India. So you get Western grid, Eastern grid, etc., which may vary quite significantly. The CEA itself actually reports emissions at a very granular uh, level. So you can actually estimate emissions factors um, by state and in fact even by source if you actually look at the CEA disclosures. So one other way to get a very accurate estimate here that is still using CEA data is to actually look at the CEA disclosure, look at what state you're in and what your state-based emissions will look like, and on the basis of that, estimate your emission factor. Now, this varies quite a lot state to state. So it varies by a factor of 4 to 5x, depending on kind of what state you're in and where you're getting your energy from. So the correct way to do this is likely if you're doing this for a regulatory purpose like BRSR, most third-party assurance providers will require that you use the CEA number, because that's what has become standard. But my suggestion, just to future-proof this work, is to also calculate based off some of these other factors that I've suggested and provide, again, even in BRSR, there is an option to kind of provide an explanation and a description and which I would use that space to talk about the uncertainty associated with this. The reason that it's important to talk about the uncertainty is that as there is increasing regulatory demand to decarbonize and become more efficient, it's important to be able to look at historical data and demonstrate that decarbonization. So you don't want to necessarily be hamstrung by estimating with a low emission factor today and then having to revisit that a couple of years down the road with a higher emission factor, because then even if your underlying activity data has decreased, so even if you become more efficient, it may look like your emissions have gone up, even though that may not be the case. So, so I hope that answers the question. But great, great. Okay. Great. All right. So let's continue.
We have one more question. So, Mr. Binoy.
Yeah. Very quickly. In one situation, I noticed that the US EPA grid factors. Do they keep revising it once in a while so that retrospectively, is there a requirement to go recount,
Yes.
recompute
So
it?
yes. So the CEA actually releases guidance annually, and it does not necessarily estimate this kind of nationwide emission factor annually, but it releases reports annually that can be used to estimate a state-wise or even region-wise emission factor. One thing I just wanted to call out is that you mentioned the US EPA grid factors. So
Yeah.
the US EPA grid factors would not be directly applicable here, but the but it's the same idea conceptually, in that we would basically use the same approach to estimate the CEA derived grid factors for this for India.
Yeah, in particular case, global emission absolute values kept changing. Then we found out that, okay, there was a grid factor revision applied on it. So that's why it has.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So conceptually, it's the same idea. You'd have to kind of understand your emission factors, and that's actually why. So as I was saying earlier, you want to also quantify the uncertainty and variability here, such that in future years you can still point to that variability when you're trying to demonstrate a decarbonizing trend.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
To answer one more question has been asked in the comments. Well, if there are APCM installed, will emissions calculation change?
By APCMs, are you talking about air pollution?
Yes, sir. Air pollution control.
Okay. Okay. They will not. So most air pollutant scrubbers focus primarily on particulate and NOx from these pollution sources, as well as SOx sometimes. And so those are also very important pollutants, but they're not greenhouse gases. So most of the scrubbers that are part of these air pollution control mechanisms are focused on particulate matter and nitrogen oxides, which is different from nitrous oxides, which are greenhouse gases. And so they will not be. So it won't change. It won't change. What may change though is the APCM itself may use electricity. So in some ways there may be a slight
Yes.
increase actually in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Okay.
Great. For what it's worth, these scrubbers, when applied at point of sources, can actually have a huge impact on your air pollutant emissions, which will become important for a lot of other regulatory reasons, but they are separate from climate-related emissions. Great. Okay, so I will keep going then. I'm going to skip this slide because we've already talked about scope 3, but basically, I won't go into it in the interest of time, but at a high level, scope 3 emissions just relate to your value chain. So thinking about your value chain is important. Okay, so an important takeaway is that carbon accounting is a very complex process, and there are many ways to quote unquote do it right. So you can have direct measurements, as I mentioned. This would involve using integrated sensors into your stacks, coming and having an insurance provider conduct direct greenhouse gas flux estimations, using satellite measurements and inverse modeling techniques to validate some of these things in a way that gives you a direct understanding of, for my operational footprint, these were my CO2 emissions, these were my methane emissions. So depending on the greenhouse gas, for example, if you had a pipeline for natural gas, if you're in those sectors, it makes sense to invest in some of these direct measurement techniques, because oftentimes you don't know when your pipeline is going to spring a leak, for example. So that is not something that you can, even though that is something you can still model statistically, but it becomes a little more challenging because it's more stochastic, more random. And so as a result, actually having the monitoring capability along that pipeline is important. So this is where you would use a direct measurement, for example. You can also use life cycle assessment techniques. And so this basically, a life cycle assessment effectively just breaks down the different life cycle processes and inputs within a given product or service, and provides you an estimate for the embodied carbon associated with that product or service. So this will become important for things like the CBAM regulation in Europe, for example, where they now will require you to start thinking about how much the embodied emissions are. So any company that is exporting products to Europe, for example, starting this October, actually will need to start thinking about what their embodied carbon is of those products. So that type of accounting will come under this broad framework of life cycle assessment. And so that includes detailing your different business processes, as well as thinking through how you would benchmark these emissions. And then you have proxy estimates for your entire company, and these tend to be from physical activity data, from energy-based activity data, as well as from spend-based activity data. So again, just to kind of repeat what that means, physical activity data means things like how many liters of diesel did I use, or how many kilograms of steel did I produce, etc. Energy-based activity tends to think about the whole system in terms of what was the kilowatt hour consumption from different sources, including from fuel sources. And then spend-based views the whole system in terms of the flow of money, and then maps that flow of money to a carbon emission. So there are different ways to approach this, but these are kind of some of the high-level approaches to carbon accounting. I also want to stress that accounting is just the first step to carbon management. So today we've largely focused on accounting, but the goal here is to say, okay, once you've accounted and understood, what your carbon emissions actually are, you actually need to go through a benchmarking exercise that is sector specific to understand how you compare with the rest of your peers, and how you compare with the best of your peers. Like, how do you compare with the best in class performance? Because the reason that is important is that flows right into risk assessment. So thinking through, once you've actually benchmarked yourself, you have to think about what is your transition risk, how carbon intensive are you relative to your peers, relative to your competitors, and how will that impact how you might be regulated and how you might be affected by these regulations, as well as how you'll be affected by market demand relative to your competitors. On the basis of that risk assessment, both transition risk as well as physical risk, you need to think about target setting. So we were talking briefly on this call about SBTI, but what SBTI stands for is Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what SBTI guidance allows you to do is set quote unquote science-based targets that are sector specific for your sector, that will give you a sense of how much you need to decarbonize over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, with the goal of eventually hitting net zero. Also, I want to say that net zero doesn't actually mean going to zero. It's usually defined as a reduction of about 90% or greater relative to your baseline year. So the idea here is not that you will ever be able to remove all emissions, but that if we sufficiently decarbonize as a society, we could actually hit that 1.5 degree warming goal. Just for context here on targets, when I say 1.5 degree, as I said earlier, 2.8 degree, we are already, relative to pre-industrial um, temperatures, we have already warmed the Earth about 1 degree, roughly, about 1.1 degrees actually. And so when we say hit a 1.5 degree target, that means that we have about zero point 0.5, zero point 0.4 degrees to go. So that's how much you can think of that as like the budget that we are drawing from. And if we don't act quickly, we will quickly overshoot that. In fact, the IPCC report most recently, the sixth AR6, the sixth assessment, basically said that if we continue with business as usual, we are likely to hit 1.5 degrees of warming as soon as the 2030s. So, within the next 10-ish years, we're likely to basically use up all of that budget. And so that's why target setting becomes important, because it gives us a very clear sense of, how much we will need to decarbonize if we actually want to hit these targets. One other thing, just to provide some context for target setting, I talked a little bit about why climate change is important, but it is particularly countries like India that are developing and don't have a lot of resilient infrastructure that will be impacted most by the impacts of climate change, because things like sea level rise, flooding, etc., will disproportionately impact the supply chains of companies that are not set up to mitigate those risks. So setting targets in a way that help mitigate both the transition risk in terms of how much you're emitting, as well as the physical risk in terms of your exposure to physical risk, is going to be increasingly important. And that actually flows straight into scenario planning, because you need to think about how you would actually decarbonize, what the risks might be under different scenarios, different warming scenarios, different regulatory scenarios, etc. So thinking through the tools and structures to actually scenario plan, 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future is increasingly important. Oftentimes, companies are not used to necessarily thinking on those time horizons. But with something like climate, it will become increasingly important. So any company that is interested in, continuing to operate 20 years from now will have to start thinking about the impact of climate change, because regardless of anything, climate change will impact them, whether it's their just physical risk, transition risk, their supply chain. It is not something that any of us can escape. So starting to think about that and planning scenarios accordingly is going to be important. And then again, once those scenarios have been planned and once you understand the risks involved with different scenarios, thinking about what interventions you actually want to take, both from a decarbonization perspective, also from a risk abatement perspective. What are the steps that you want to take? So, for example, from a decarbonization perspective, it could be, say, move to 100% renewable energy, for example, or it could be, moving away from using internal combustion vehicles and using, electric vehicles, for example. So there are many different types of interventions. Using different and more sustainable materials might be another type of intervention. So basically, you have to think a little bit about kind of the types of interventions that you might prioritize given your targets, given the targets that you've set and the scenarios that you've planned. And then once you've set those interventions, you need to start thinking about tracking. And so this is where it is important to start building the capability within your organization to actually track and report and assess internally what your emissions are. And so when I say, so what I mean by that is, if once you've decided, what your targets are, you need systems to be able to be sufficiently dynamic to understand whether the decisions you're making are actually moving you towards those targets. So, for example, if you bring in a consultant once every 2 years to conduct a um, carbon accounting exercise, it may be too infrequent to actually give you the capability to make decisions on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis to align with those targets. So, something to think about internally is, how do you get the data and analyze it in a way that is expedient enough that allows you to actually align with the goals that you've set for yourself, in a way that you are not then dependent on this external exercise happening, once every 2 years, once every 5 years, to determine where you are. And then similarly, if you are tracking appropriately, it is important to kind of transparently report, including, as I was mentioning earlier, with the uncertainties associated with those estimates, because that is important both from a just good business responsibility, transparency perspective, but also to demonstrate that you are actually setting a clear roadmap, that you have a clear historical, empirical set of emissions estimates that you are using to leverage towards a concrete decarbonization roadmap, such that 5-10 years from now, both from a consumer facing perspective as well as from a regulatory perspective, you have a clear historical record for how much you have decarbonized, and that becomes very important. And then that ties in directly to the last line here, which is dissemination. So as I was mentioning earlier, this is not just a regulatory reaction. There are a lot of opportunities in this space. As I was mentioning earlier, CBAM, which is the European um, framework to actually account for embodied carbon for products that are coming into the European Union. That can be viewed as a regulatory step that could be challenging for companies to adhere to, but it could also be looked at as an opportunity where if you sufficiently decarbonized your own processes such that the embodied carbon of your product is actually much more competitive than the same product coming from a different competitor in a different part of the world, then you are actually at a strong competitive advantage there. And so basically thinking about how to disseminate and leverage all of this in a positive economic context is also something that will become increasingly important. So I'll actually just stop here for a second if people have questions. Also, Shivangi, I know that we're at about an hour. Do we have some time to go over?
Sure, sir.
What I'll do is, yeah, go ahead. I think there's a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Siddhan. My am Babu. My question is regarding the life cycle assessment. When we talk
Yeah.
about the LCA, my question is it for calculating only the scope 3? For example, if you look into my production, I have raw material. With the raw material, I am making a product. So I have cradle to gate. Then after the gate, I am exporting the material. So that means when we do the LCA for calculating the GSG, is it for only a scope 3 emission, or only I need to use the LCA method for all of my emissions?
So great question. So the LCA is actually a different paradigm. So you won't think about LCAs to calculate scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, because LCAs tend to take a product specific lens as opposed to a company specific lens. But a proxy for what you are calculating, LCAs will actually provide you scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So if you were to think about what is embodied in your product, it will include the direct emissions because those processes will be there. So those will be your scope 1 emissions. It will include the electricity you're using in that product. So those will be your scope 2 emissions. And because if you're doing a cradle to grave assessment, it will also include your upstream and downstream impacts, which would map to your scope 3, where your value chain emissions. So I guess the longer answer to your question is a little more nuanced, but the short answer is that life cycle assessments are not built to directly map to scope 1 and scope 2 or scope 3, but a cradle to grave LCA assessment will actually touch on all of these scopes.
Thank you very much for this explanation. Very clear. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I will just quickly talk about carbon markets, and then we can end, and I'm happy to stay on for as long as you'd like for questions. But I just wanted to introduce the concept of a carbon market. And so the general idea, so I've talked about carbon emissions and carbon accounting, and I've also talked about how regulatory pressure will focus on reducing these greenhouse gas emissions. And so what a carbon market allows you to do is if you directly sequester um, carbon dioxide or some greenhouse gas, or if you are below the amount that has been allocated to you in terms of emissions, that amount you are able to package effectively and sell as a carbon credit. So in this example, in this diagram, you see emitter B. So there has been, let's say there are two factories that are emitting in the same sector. And let's say the government of India has regulated that for this type of factory, for this much, for, let's say steel production, here are the, this is the amount of emissions that have been allocated to both factories. Now, in this example, emitter B has gone through a carbon accounting exercise and gone through a carbon management exercise and significantly reduced their emissions such that they are actually below that allocated guideline. So the blue bar here is the amount of carbon credits that they are eligible to produce. So they would basically go to the authorizing entity and demonstrate that they were significantly below the allocated emissions, and as a result would be granted these carbon credits, which they are then able to sell within, again, a regulatory framework, within a regulated market. They would be able to sell to emitter A. Now, the reason emitter A would need those credits is because if you look at this chart, emitter A has actually had the emissions for emitter A are actually above their allocated emissions. So they would need to offset those emissions by purchasing these carbon credits. So the way a carbon market basically works is that you have people that are producing carbon credits, often called carbon offsets as well. And you have people purchasing these carbon credits because they are above their allocated emissions. So India actually has a carbon credit scheme, and it is in the process of being ironed out. So there was another intimation by the government in at the end of June that talked about setting up the structure to actually determine what the rules will be for the Indian carbon credit market. So we don't know the specifics there yet. We don't know exactly what the specifics of that market will look like. But we do have existing structures such as the Perform Achieve Trade scheme, the PAT scheme, that will likely be leveraged. But I won't go into the details there because it tends to be a little nuanced and it's still very early on in the process, and it's at the draft stage in many ways. So the general idea though here again is that with these regulated entities, they will be able to produce, sell, and if required, purchase carbon credits within this regulated market. So the key kind of concepts here, again, I'll be quick and we can then pause for questions. The key concepts here are the allowances, which is basically what I was saying earlier, where as an entity, what are you allowed to emit? The carbon credit and offset, which again, as an entity, am I able to produce credits or do I need to purchase credits? The concept of a carbon project, which is now a third party entity, might say, okay, I will go and purchase a piece of barren land and reforest it in a way that sequesters carbon. And as a result, I would like to be granted carbon credits for that project. So these types of projects are called carbon projects. There's also a monitoring, verification, and certification process for those projects. So as you can imagine, tomorrow if I go out and plant a tree, I can't just claim a carbon credit. There has to be a monitoring, verification, certification process in order to make sure that I've adhered to the appropriate guidelines. And then there's the concept of how do you price the carbon credit. So what is the price of carbon? And so you can think about it in some ways. So let's just go back to this example of emitter A and emitter B. The price will be a dynamic price and it's a market-based price, but it will also directly depend on how expensive it is for, in this case, emitter A to actually decarbonize. So the more expensive it is for emitter A to decarbonize, the higher the value of the carbon credit, because they are more likely to pay more for a carbon credit relative to investing in the decarbonization process. So you will see this dynamic change in carbon pricing over the next few years as one, regulations tighten. So there's suddenly a lot of demand for these, which will likely make carbon prices spike. But then you'll also see this opposite impact where you'll have a lot of solutions providers come in and actually make it cheaper to decarbonize, where anyone who isn't decarbonizing will be sufficiently penalized, but anyone that is interested in decarbonizing should be able to get below the allocated greenhouse gas emissions to them. I'll just pause for a second. I think we have another question.
Can I ask the question, please?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Siddharth. The question I have is, you said the carbon credit pricing is market based and depends on the cost of excess emissions. Now, is this going to be industry specific, or is there a common unified denominator kind of a pricing mechanism? So, if you could throw a little bit more light on this aspect, please.
Yeah, no, great question. So the current, and I think this touches on another question in the chat as well. So the current thinking, and again, a lot of this is still being ironed out. So it will likely change over the next year or so, and there'll be more clarity there. But the current thinking is that it will not be industry specific, and that they will be able to be internally traded across sectors and across industries, which is to say that then there will be a standard carbon price in a way that does not enable like an arbitrage across different sectors. Uh, or rather, I mean, it does enable different sectors to kind of contribute, but there's no clear kind of difference in price across different sectors. But I will caveat all of this by saying that it is still currently in the process of being ironed out. So these are all speculations at this point.
Thank you.
Great.
We have another question, sir.
Yeah.
In the comments, if you may allow. Yeah. Is it necessary for both emitters to be from same industry?
Yeah. So traditionally, for something like the PAT scheme versus something like the new proposed carbon market, it will change. In a true kind of carbon market, it will not be necessary. They will be like it will be fungible. The actual carbon credit will be fungible. But again, there are some. It remains to be seen what the actual guidance will look like. In theory, conceptually, there is no need for them to be from the same industry. I think we have another question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Mr. Akshay, please ask a question.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Pai. Can you just let me know, like, is the reporting for this carbon credit is anywhere mentioned in the PSR report? Let's say, like, if a company, a heavy emitting company, does buy carbon credit on a larger scale, do they have to report it in the PSR report also?
So right now there is no standardized allocations that are required to be reported in the BRSR. So you wouldn't have to report it. You can report it as part of your BRSR, but it is a separate section. So what you are not allowed to do, if you look at the BRSR guidance, you are not allowed to subtract your emissions using those credits and say this was my emission because I purchased credit. You still have to report your emissions, but there is a qualitative area where you can provide estimates for your avoided emissions or your purchased offsets.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ramani.
No, so there are third-party portals like Vera, for example, or the gold standard, where you can go purchase voluntary credits. So that's another difference, is that there are voluntary carbon markets and then there are regulated carbon markets. The the Indian carbon credit market will eventually be a highly regulated carbon market. So that will not be a third-party website. There are third-party websites that allow you as a company to go purchase. Let's say you as a company wanted to hit a carbon neutral target. You can go to these websites and purchase the required number of offsets, but that would not have any regulatory impact. It would just enable you to position your company as carbon neutral. So there may be other kind of market reasons to do that, but it would not have a regulatory impact. So there are websites that will allow you to do that kind of work, but those are not. Those are all voluntary carbon markets.
Ms. Padmaja?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Pai, just wanted to clarify as when we speak about the concepts of carbon monitoring, verification, and certification, who would be the qualifying entity who would give these certifications?
Yeah. So it depends. So in India, it could be the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, for example. But it depends on the carbon market specifically. So, for example, for the third-party markets that I mentioned, like Gold Standard and Vera, they have their own monitoring and verification guidance that needs to be followed. So it depends on the specific carbon market. In India, it will likely be the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, although again, these are it is still in process in terms of what the final guidance will be.
All right, thank you. Mr. Anshuman?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, you're audible, sir.
So my question is to Dr. Pai is, what is the basis of this pricing dynamics? You told about the carbon pricing dynamics. Is it only a demand and supply thing or any other thing?
Yes, it's basically demand and supply, and the result of the demand and supply comes from how expensive it is to decarbonize and how much you need to decarbonize. So you can imagine, depending on what the allocations are set as, if the allocations are very high, then there is very little demand for carbon credits, so the price is quite low. If the allocations are very low, then there's a high demand for carbon credits, so the price is quite high.
Okay. And how to determine that allocation?
So that is a regulatory allocation, so that the government will determine, and it will be sector specific most likely.
So there will be a fixed framework, right, for this?
There'll be a single framework that for what will usually happen is that once enacted, there'll be certain sectors that are regulated, and it will slowly expand to other sectors. And each sector will have its own guidance around how to estimate. So how do you account for emissions as well as what the allocated emissions are, and that will change because, as you can imagine, a very large company, a very small company will have in absolute numbers very different carbon emissions. So the allocations will not be based on the absolute emissions. They will usually be based on things like emissions intensity, which is for a unit of, let's say, steel produced, how much carbon are you emitting?
Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem. Great. So I think that is most of what I had to say. I think we have a little more time if people had questions. Otherwise, happy to end a little early as well. Yeah, hi. I think we had
Yes,
a question.
yeah, please.
Yes, please. For carbon credits? So a GHG accounting, I don't have a case study prepared, but if you had a question, I'm happy to talk about it. I don't have a specific case study prepared, but if you have a general question on how any of these things work, I'm happy to walk you through it. Yeah, happy to do a different session on that specifically. Those processes tend to get into the weeds a little bit, so just in the interest of time, I haven't included a case study here. But yeah, fair enough, fair question. Thank you.
Any more questions from every delegates? Do you have any questions that you would want to ask from sir?
I'll keep this up.
Siddhanta, do you want to? Yes, Binoy.
Yeah. Would there be a possibility to connect with you separately on a couple of clarifications, Mrs. Siddhant?
Sure, absolutely. I can leave my
I'll ask
email in
Shivanki.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Please, yes, absolutely. Please,
All
please
right.
feel free
Thank
to
you
reach
so
out.
much. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sir. We can route the question to sir whenever you notify us. And
Yeah. Thank you.
Siddhanta, do you want to have a final word on carbon accounting and specifically something for India? What does the future look like?
Yeah, so I think in general, so there's a lot of regulatory tailwinds around thinking about climate change in India and incorporating it within business decision making. So there's a lot of guidance from SEBI, for example, in terms of reporting requirements, not only around climate but also other environmental and social indicators. But climate is a big focus of that. There's also guidance around value chain reporting, which means that in addition to kind of, an optional scope 3 reporting, large companies now will need to actually think of their value chain as a mandatory process as they think about their reporting requirements. The RBI released a position paper a few months ago where they talked about the importance for large financial institutions to stress test their portfolios. So that's something that we work with specifically is with large financial institutions that are interested in stress testing their portfolios. And all of this is to say that the impacts of these will be pervasive in that they will touch every sector of our economy. And the regulations that are already here and that are proposed over the next few years will mean that it is important for companies to start thinking about their exposure to climate risks and their opportunities